Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Roadmap to Testing a Design System with Marie Drake, Principal Test Automation Engineer at News UK. Before Marie kicks off, I'll give a short intro about her. In her role as Principal Test Automation Engineer at News UK, Marie is responsible for setting up the overall QA strategy and ensuring that the company delivers a high-quality product to its end users. Previously, Marie was a test automation consultant working with different customers from various industries, helping them speed up testing cycles and improving go-to-market timelines. Marie is also a sought-after speaker talking at software conferences and meetups, such as Software Testing Trends in 2019, Digital Women in Tech Intro to Cypress, and Applitools' own Future of Testing 2020 virtual conference, which took place last month. In addition, Marie is a Cypress IO ambassador, and she also writes about tech at mariedrake.com, where you can find posts she wrote about testing and tutorials she shared related to test automation. So without any further ado, Marie, the stage is yours.
Hi everyone, and thanks Adi for the nice introduction. So as Adi mentioned, I'm Marie and I currently work as a principal test automation engineer at News UK. If you want to ask me any follow-up questions after this talk or you simply just want to connect, I can be found on Twitter at mcruzdrake, and I've also added my LinkedIn ID here, which is Marie-Drake. So feel free to add me there after this webinar. So today I will be sharing our experience about our roadmap to testing a design system here at News UK. So I'm just going to talk a little bit more information about myself. So I'm originally from the Philippines, but I currently live in the UK. I have about 7 years experience as a tester, and apart from my work role at News, so Adi mentioned that I'm also a Cypress ambassador, where I talked about the different features that Cypress can offer to the tech community. I'm also a tech blogger, so you can find my tutorials or any thoughts on testing and test automation at mariedrake.com. Recently, I'm also one of the co-organizer for the Cypress UK Community Meetup Group. And of course, I'm also a mom and a woman in tech. I try my best to inspire other women out there to pursue a career in tech. And lately, I've been sharing my story to different women in STEM groups to raise awareness and support. One of my most interesting fact that I like to tell people is I actually saw the great Stephen Hawking on a cruise ship once, which was quite surreal. So I'm currently working at News, as I mentioned. And first, to anyone who doesn't know who News UK is, so News UK is a news publishing company and part of the global News Corp brand. They are responsible for publishing newspaper brands such as The Sun, The Times, and The Sunday Times. And most recently, they've also acquired wireless radio stations. So first off, I'd like to go over the agenda and give an introduction of what I'll be talking about today. So first and foremost, I'll be giving a quick overview about the tech reset which happened at News UK. I'll then give a talk about product platforms, which is the team that I am part of, and why we created the NewsKit Design System. I'll then proceed in talking about what our testing requirements were to successfully support the delivery of NewsKit Design System. And then I'll talk about a specific testing issue that we always face here at News UK. I'll then give you an overview of what our testing strategy is, as well as looking at our choice of testing tools and our testing workflow. And lastly, I'll share the overall Applitools experience and talk about how it has met our testing requirements and the general feedback from our team. So let's start from the beginning, the tech reset. If we look at News Corp's global strategy, it's actually to break down the siloed approach of our companies so that we can remove any unnecessary duplication amongst the different teams. The basic idea is that services, tools, processes should be shared and reused. When it's time for us to respond to new brand ideas, this creates a strain on the team's existing workloads because we essentially have to start from scratch on each new idea. So, for example, if we have a new offering, so such as Virgin Radio, different teams will have to work from scratch to get an application up and running. There is also a well known incident within the news tech called the Fabulous Pink incident. So basically, Fabulous, which is a well known brand under the sun, wanted to change their brand color to a different shade of pink. The different technology teams estimated that this change will take around 6 months because there is no single source of truth to make this change. And we're only talking about changing the brand color here. So just imagine the frustration from the business here. Now, because of this tech reset, a new team called Product Platforms was born. So, Product Platform's objective is to provide a library of shared reusable components that will serve as building blocks from which title teams and brands across News UK and also News Corp can reuse. Within product platforms, we're actually broken down into smaller teams, with each team responsible for a different product. In this presentation, I'll focus only on the NewsKit Design System team. So we essentially want to remove any duplication, such as the number of share bars that we have across the business. As you can see here, each brand has their own version of their share bar. But essentially, if you take away the theming and all the other styling, they look pretty similar. The important question as well is, do we really need to have 19 share bars? Now, having 19 share bars mean that there's 19 code and design repetitions, which means that money and resource is wasted because we're just reinventing the wheel every single time. There is also very little value in repeating work across the organization. And what happens if there is a new brand at News UK? We definitely want to break the cycle of having our 20th share bar. And this is why one of the core offering of product platforms is the NewsKit Design System. So, NewsKit Design System aims to address all the inconsistencies that have piled up over the years of having different solutions. Every development team has their own preference on how they would implement a share bar, for example. However, we saw that this leads to code and design duplication. And oftentimes, areas such as accessibility are often missed because of not adhering to a certain standard. Now, design system, it aims to create components that can be easily reused by different teams, and it also enforces them to adhere to a set of agreed standards. If we try to link this to BDD or behavior-driven development, we are essentially trying to speak the same design language across multiple teams. By speaking the same language, we'll be able to deliver things faster and much more efficiently, unlike the fabulous pink incident. Now, having a design system would be cost efficient because we don't have to duplicate the work across different titles. This is also related to my second point, which is reusability. New brands can also be delivered faster because they can use the foundations and the components straight away. It's also scalable, and I like the analogy that our head of product platforms gave on a recent meeting. He talked about design system as similar to building a Lego. You can scale it down to create small pieces, or you can scale it up to build much more complex features. It also promotes a standard way of working since there is a single source of truth. And lastly, it also promotes consistency across different title teams. So just to showcase to everyone the different components that our title teams can use, we're using Storybook, as you can see from this sample image here. Now, all possible variants are listed as scenarios per component, which shows the different use cases. The idea here is that different title teams can use this different component instead and build it up to their liking. So in here, you can see that you can select different flag variations. You can select different variations if you want if you want an article stand force, or if you want an audio player, you can also choose from different options. On top of that, we also have a NewsKit documentation site, which our title teams can use. So in here, they can basically select what component they would like to use. They can use the playground feature that we have, and then at the end, it will show a code snippet that they can import in their code base. So in this particular example, I'm just doing some customization on how I would like a button component to look. And then once I'm finished, I can just copy the code that's been provided to me. Cool. So now let's talk about the exciting part, the testing strategy. Since this is the first time that News UK have implemented a design system, we need to make sure that the testing strategy is also well thought of because our product will be used by multiple title teams. We listed down what our testing requirements would be, and from these requirements, we narrowed down the types of testing activities that we would need, as well as the different test automation tools that can support our testing. So, in terms of the first requirement, we identified that we need to be able to test different components easily. Since NewsKit design system will mature and grow over time, we will be delivering a lot of components. So we need to make sure that for any code changes, we can verify the different components easily. Since different title teams will use the different components, cross-browser visual validation is a must for us. So what we did was we looked at data from Google Analytics to see which browsers and mobile devices our users are coming from. And we use this data as a starting point to decide which browsers and devices we must cover in our testing. The third requirement that we've identified is we need to be able to write visual tests with less maintenance in mind, so it doesn't impact or delay our development and testing workflow. So when we have visual changes to our component, rather than maintaining the baseline images manually, which can be quite lengthy, especially if one change affected a lot of components. So we want to be able to speed this process up. Relating to speed as well, so since this is a new product, we want to make sure that our build pipeline is high performing in order for us to provide a fast feedback loop to our designers and developers. And therefore, we set a time limit that it should be finished within 10 minutes. Since collaboration is very important in a design system, we also want to integrate design review earlier on the process in order for us to catch any issues or any misunderstandings earlier on. We basically want our designers to be involved and make sure that the visual changes matches what was in their design specification. We've also identified that we want our components to be built with accessibility in mind on both the component and site level, so all users can use our product. And because some of our components are going to be complex and it will contain more functionality, we need to be able to catch these functional issues earlier on. And lastly, we need to make sure that all relevant tests are written before deploying a feature. So there's only two QA engineers within the product platforms team, which includes myself already. And so we want to be able to share the responsibility of writing the automated tests with the developers. Now, from the testing requirements, we've identified as a team what types of testing we need to do as a must. So this includes, unit and snapshot testing to test all the individual methods and functions. We also identified that we need to do component testing to test individual components, which we broke down into three different activities. So we've got functional testing, visual, and accessibility. For our NewsKit documentation site, so front-end testing activities must also include the same types of testing as components, so functional, visual, and accessibility. And lastly, as I mentioned on the previous slide, cross-browser testing is really important because we need to be able to render these different components without any issues on different browsers and devices. So while writing these different testing requirements, there is one problem though. So visual testing has been a really important testing strategy here at News UK. Other teams at News, they're already using visual testing tools, but these visual tests always end up flaky. Before working with product platforms, I was already introducing visual tests on the previous team that I was part of. So let's just quickly talk about the limitation with functional testing. So the limitation is that it's difficult or even impossible to catch all the visual changes that your feature might have. In this example code snippet here, we're basically checking if an element is visible or not. However, what if there's style changes? You can definitely write more code to make sure that you cover these, but then your code will be very lengthy and complex. It's guaranteed as well that when you have a new tester or a developer onboarded, the moment that they saw that one test has a lot of code, they won't even try to maintain that test. So with visual testing, we are validating what the user sees on different viewports, browsers, or mobile devices. However, it's very time consuming when you have to do it manually. So just imagine, so there is an image here and someone told you that, you have to test this manually every single time. There are 30 differences and you can probably find them after quite some time, but then this provides a slower feedback loop. The most obvious solution would be, of course, to automate this. Now, automated visual testing is not new. With automated visual testing, you have a baseline image, which is your source of truth. Now, every time there is a code change and then the visual tests are run, a new test image will be taken. The visual testing tool will then compare this test image with the baseline image, and then it will check the differences. At the end, when it's finished, it will report to us whether our test passed or failed. The problem, though, and I'm sure that I'm not the only person who's experiencing this, is with pixel by pixel comparison, it's very sensitive to small changes. Even if you have a 1 pixel difference, your test will fail, even though on the human eye, the two images look exactly similar. If you look at this sample test image here, so if you just ignore the mismatch image in the middle, and if you compare the two images on left and on the right, some of the changes that were reported, like it looks okay. To me, visually, this looks fine. However, because these two images were taken on different machine setups, the tool has reported a lot of pixel differences. You can run your test on containers such as Docker to make sure that both the baseline and test image are generated using the same configuration. But again, from personal experience, I still get a small subset of pixel differences. And what if you have dynamic data? In this particular example, we have a change of data here, but the overall layout on the rails it's basically similar. There's no change on the layout. So what you can do is you can probably set the mismatch threshold to be slightly higher, So your test will fail only if it reached the threshold that you define. The problem with this though is if you set the threshold slightly higher, then you might miss actual visual bugs because it will be ignored by the tool. Another problem. So most of the existing open source tools for visual testing only runs on one or two browsers. As an example, one of the tools that we were using before, which is called Backstop.js, is a very popular visual testing framework. However, it only runs visual tests on Chrome headlessly. iSpy, which is a tool that was actually created by one of the teams here at News UK, is another visual testing tool. iSpy hooks into your Selenium grid to run your visual tests on different browsers. But still, it's a bit limited. So if you're using the official Selenium Docker images, they only have images for Chrome and Firefox. But what if you want to run your test on Safari? Now, all these different issues will eventually lead to a flaky testing pipeline, which then leads to visual bugs being slipped to production. Over time, you lose confidence of your testing pipeline, especially if these tests are always failing due to these pixel differences. When your team loses confidence to your automated tests, it defeats the purpose of having them in the first place. And this is definitely something that we don't want to happen in our design system. So just to quickly show you just some of the production visual bugs that we have deployed, and I'm embarrassed to say this, but I'm just gonna show you some of the bugs that we have deployed because of our flaky visual testing pipeline. So if you look at some of the images here, the first one was actually quite bad because the arrow icon was so enlarged on the tablet on the tablet viewport. So just imagine the shock of our tablet readers when they saw this bug. The last image that you can see here, it was actually a very recent bug that we slipped to production, and the issue was the rail name was it was slightly indented to the right. So now that we've established that visual testing is important, how can we solve these different visual testing issues? We know that we need to look for a different tool that would be able to solve these issues. And at the same time, we've also identified a set of testing requirements that we have to achieve in product platforms. So one of the first tasks that I was given was to do a POC on visual testing tools. During this time, myself and my colleague Sin narrowed down our choices between Screener, Applitools, and Hapo. We both engage with these different companies to understand if their offering can help us. And after some time looking at the different pros and cons of each of these tools, doing example projects, and demoing it to the rest of the team, we ultimately decided that Applitools has met our requirements the most. The next step for me was to create a business case and justify why it would benefit us. As Applitools is a commercial tool, I had to make a very convincing case as to why we need it and why open source pixel by pixel visual tools are of limited use. We also looked at different UI testing tools such as Puppeteer, Selenium, and Cypress. After weighing all the pros and cons again for each of this tool, ultimately we ended up deciding to use Cypress because of its great developer experience as well as its visual test runner. Personally, I've had great experience so far with Cypress, and we definitely wanted a tool that our developers will find easier to use because they will be helping us in writing the relevant tests. So let's now look at the complete picture of what different testing tools the team have chosen to meet all our testing requirements. Cool. So here are the other tools that we use to test our design system. So apart from Applitools and Cypress, we also use Jest. For accessibility, we use Axe, specifically a plugin called Cypress Axe, and we integrate it with our Cypress test so we can automate some of our accessibility requirements. This means that on every component that the team builds, we can test for accessibility much earlier on the process. We also use Google Lighthouse and Wave, which both gives a nice report on how accessible our documentation site is. For screen reader testing, we also use Safari's VoiceOver tool. What's great is one of our developers is an accessibility advocate, and he shares knowledge within the team as well as across news on how to use the screen reader for accessibility testing. So just to give you an overview, so on the next following slides, we'll look at how we managed to integrate Applitools in our project, how we wrote the tests, as well as how we're doing the test maintenance. So the first thing that we needed to do was to configure it to test our components. And the good thing was because we did the POC already, it didn't took us a long time to integrate it with our actual project. Now, Applitools has an integration with Storybook, so the setup was fairly straightforward. We had to install ICE Storybook and export our Applitools API key locally first, and then create this config file with just 15 lines of code. And then from here, we were able to configure our Storybook components to run on different browsers, including IE11 and Safari. In terms of the actual test, so Applitools will automatically grab the components from Storybook. So all we needed to do was to write a couple of test commands and then run it as part of our Circle CI pipeline integration. We also needed to configure Applitools with our Cypress test, and the setup, which was similar with Storybook, didn't take us too long. So first, we had to install the ICE Cypress package and configure it to integrate with our Cypress test, which was fairly quick because there is a command that you can use to automatically do the setup called npx ICE setup. To run the full snapshots of the different pages that we want to test on different browsers, we created a separate config file as well as the different test commands that we can then use when we run it in our CI pipeline. Now, in terms of writing the actual visual test, it also didn't took us long. So as you can see here, there's just 31 lines of code. And with just 31 lines of code, we managed to visually test 9 different pages from our documentation site on different browsers and mobile device. Now, let's talk about test maintenance. So, prior to using Applitools, whenever there is a mismatch on any of our images, we would have to maintain the baseline images manually. And this maintenance actually took us some time. So now that we're using Applitools, we found that the test maintenance is very quick. So you can see on the video here that we're using the grouping feature in Applitools. So you can group the similar differences, and then from here, you can easily approve or reject the changes in our visual test. Since the different snapshots are grouped, once you accept one of them, it will also apply the changes to the other images, which made the test maintenance really simpler for us. Now, how did we solve dynamic changes? So if you look at this image really closely here, we've got an audio player component where the track is loading. If we use pixel by pixel tools, this will be reported as a failure. But with Applitools, we can add a region here, like the layout region, for example. So with the layout region, it will ignore dynamic content changes and it will only validate the overall layout. So now we can avoid the situation where our build pipeline is blocked because of dynamic data differences. Now, let's move on to how we did accessibility testing. So apart from visual tests, accessibility testing is something new that we introduce in product platforms. We know that with the design system comes with good accessibility standards, so we have to make sure that we test for accessibility much earlier on. Um, if we integrate automation tools, it will help us catch issues and give early feedback to the team. So by using Cypress and Cypress Acts, we have maintained good accessibility standards that could have been easily missed if we didn't have this. And in terms of installation, all we needed to do was install the Cypress Acts package and then import it to our Cypress support/index.js file. Here's just a quick code snippet on how we write the test. So basically, for every component, we have some default accessibility rules that we've defined. And then on the next slide, I'll show you how we actually run it. Cool. So I'm just gonna quickly play this video recording here to show you how we've automated some of the accessibility testing requirements. So as you can see here, each of our component is validated against a set of accessibility rules. And if there are any issues, you can see here that the test will fail. Now, when you open up your DevTools console, you can see much more information as to what the accessibility violation is. And then there's also a link to a URL, which points you to some guidelines on how to fix the issue. So of course, it's not a foolproof solution because only around 20% of accessibility issues can be caught by automated tests. So it's very important that we use other tools as well for accessibility, such as doing the screen reader testing. So you might have the ARIA labels defined, or you have the different alt text attributes added in, but you still need to check manually if these values make sense. The team is always pushing for accessibility, so we don't exclude people with disabilities. And most recently, one of my colleagues did a flash talk at news to raise more awareness in this area. So we have the tools that we need to help us with our testing. The next thing that I want to talk about now is our testing workflow as a whole. So I like to start by saying that we're changing our approach so that quality is everyone's responsibility. We want to move away from a model where testers are seen as gatekeepers and often get the blame if something was missed and a bug was deployed to production. Now, starting from having early meetings, we make sure that quality is baked in, and we make sure that we add automated tests, that needs to be added while the ticket is being worked on. It's a team responsibility at the end of the day. So we've also integrated this in our code review process. So what we did was we updated our pull request guidelines so that relevant tests and documentation are added by the respective developers. Also, by having a testing checklist, this helps them look at areas that they need to check. So, as I mentioned on one of the earlier slides, we have a requirement that our build pipelines should be finished within 10 minutes. So, as you can see from the screenshot here, we run multiple jobs in parallel as much as we can to speed up the pipeline and provide that fast feedback loop. We've also decided to have an approval step that you can see here on the component visual testing, because as a developer, when you create a pull request, you normally have to push more than one commits, and you don't necessarily want to run the visual test on every commit. However, we've made it a mandatory check so that before you merge your pull request, the component visual test must be run and it must pass. Now, when a pull request is merged to develop, similarly, we run most of the jobs in parallel. At the moment, we only run the documentation site visual tests when a feature is merged to develop due to our license restrictions. However, in the future, we have plans to get this added on our PR workflow so we can also catch visual issues on our documentation site earlier on. With CircleCI's GitHub integration, we can easily see the results of our tests, so it gives an indicator to the whole team if a feature is okay to be merged. We're also utilizing Applitools GitHub integration to manage any merge conflicts between baseline images for different branches. This has saved us a lot of time because if a pull request has introduced some new visual changes and you have to update the baseline images, this will not impact the other branches' baseline images. So Applitools will handle that conflict for us. And lastly, we've added Slack integration. So whenever our tests fail, the team will be notified and will take action when needed. Cool. So because we're the first team to use Applitools at News UK, so far it's been a really good experience and it meets our testing needs. In the last few slides, I'll share what the overall team feedback has been. So from development perspective, Applitools fulfills our testing requirements. We're able to test our components easily on different browsers, and it hugely simplified our visual testing process. Just to add some data to support this, so we have around 760 component tests, and our execution time is less than 5 minutes, which contributed to our high-performing build pipeline. Test maintenance is also simpler, which gives us more time to focus on other things. And if we do face any issues, the Applitools support team is always happy to help. And from design perspective, so it enabled them to have a better design review process because they can focus on the fine visual details. They also think that we have a great level of test coverage, which is really great to hear. And because we consider our design team integral in the review process, whenever they review the visual changes on the Applitools dashboard, they can easily do it once they understand the basics of using it. And finally, they also agree that the AI functionality that Applitools offer is a time saver. So I think with feedback, it's always good to hear what could be improved more because it could be a new feature that Applitools might support in the future. So the first feedback was with the Applitools dashboard to make it more intuitive, especially for new users. This could be via like simple tooltips or adding more descriptive text. The second feedback, which I think is a really good one, is to have the ability to set baseline images from the actual UI design. So design tools like Sketch, Figma, or even Abstract could maybe have a plugin with Applitools so that the UI design is the source of truth. And lastly, as I mentioned on one of the previous slide, we need to have more visual love on our documentation site because we only run them as part of our develop workflow. Cool. So where are we now? From accessibility view, you can see here that looking at the NewsKit site, it doesn't have any errors that Wave and Lighthouse can detect, which means that we are on the right track. From performance side, it still needs improvement, which is something that the team will focus on soon. And as far as I'm aware, we've also not received reports of any visual issues from our clients. So I take that as a good sign that our testing strategy that we have put in place works. In terms of product highlights, product platforms has supported the launch of Times Radio, which actually went live last month, and this is the first product which uses our audio player component. Cool. So having a solid testing strategy and defining what our testing requirements from the start has helped us support the delivery of NewsKit Design System. And if there's one takeaway from this talk, it's to use the right tools to support your testing. And that brings me to the end of my presentation. I hope this was useful and I'm ready to take some questions now.
First of all, thank you. That was amazing, Marie. Thank you so much. So we do have questions, but before Before I dive into the question, I just want to mention two things. So first of all, I see a lot of questions about, is this being recorded? And will you get the recording? So I just want to, I want everyone to be rest assured that we are recording the session, and we will email you the recording plus Marie's slides by end of day Monday. So, so don't worry about that. Plus all your thank you notes to Marie. I won't read them out loud, but I will send all of them to her once the session is over. So also know that she will get all of those too. So thank you. Um, so first question. What steps did you take to create the testing strategy that you currently have for your design system?
Yep. So one of my first tasks when I moved to this new team was to make sure that we create a cross-functional team so that we can avoid testers being the bottleneck. So the first thing that I really focus on was research for tools that would really help with the developer experience. So I focus on looking at the different tools, like what's on the market. I also, obviously look at what open source tools can be useful, because it's always good to use open source tools first. And then after we have selected, the different tools, we did a lot of POCs just to make sure that it has met our requirements, and the team are all aware of all the different new tools that we're going to introduce. And in terms of like what the different testing activities, it's really good to get everyone involved. And one of our core requirement was to make sure that we embed accessibility in mind. And that's why we decided to integrate accessibility testing much earlier on. If you have data to back up, if you can see in terms of your traffic, like which browsers your users are using, it's also really good to utilize all these different tools, so you have an idea as to which browsers to focus on. Because a lot of tools out there, they support a lot of the different versions of different browsers. But with test automation, like, you have to strike a balance. You have to check which are, for example, the topmost browsers that you have to support. So in our case, it was Chrome, like Firefox, and on the mobile devices, we have to make sure that we have support in those different viewports as well. So back up your research with data, and then get everyone involved, do a lot of demos, so at least the responsibility is not just within your shoulder. And you'll be surprised as well that some of members of your team, especially developers, they have really good inputs, so always take them into consideration when you start creating a testing strategy. I hope that answers the question.
Next question. Why did you decide to use Cypress JS rather than the Selenium WebDriver JavaScript library?
Yep. So I've used both tools, and both tools, they have their own strengths, they have their limitations as well. But one thing that I've noticed is, just from personal experience, I find that developers there, they have more positive experience in terms of using Cypress, because the setup is much easier. They can debug the tests much quicker. However, this doesn't say that Selenium is bad in terms of the setup. It just takes more time. So because there's only two QA engineers in our team, we really have to convince everyone that they should write all the tests as well. And I find that Cypress really ticks all the requirements that I was looking for in terms of getting the developers onboarded. And so far, it's working great. we know that there are limitations, with Cypress. But however, because we test most of the functional tests on the component level, so far it just managed to automate what our needs are.
How long did it take you to set up Cypress with Storybook?
So, in terms of setup, it didn't actually took us a lot of time. So when we did the initial sort of the initial pilot for the design system project, we had to or we had to look at alternative ways on how we can actually write Cypress tests on the component levels. So we definitely get everyone likes opinion on how to get it integrated. And I think it's fair to say that in terms of actual timeline, I wouldn't say it took us that very long, because once the team were able to figure out the actual integration, writing the tests, didn't took us long. The documentation site on Cypress was quite helpful, so that gave us a lot of like benefits. And because I was already using Cypress before joining the team, I was able to share some of my knowledge as well. Yep. So it's not a very um, like a straightforward answer, because I couldn't remember the actual time, but I just remember that it didn't took us very long.
So the next question is interesting. We got a lot of different people asking the same question. So I guess a lot of people are interested in that. So before you integrated Applitools, or before News UK decided to integrate Applitools, how did you carry out visual testing? Did you use another tool? Did you do it manually? What was
Yeah.
your process before that? Before
Yeah.
Applitools?
That's a very good question. Yeah. So because the actual onboarding, that we experienced with Applitools, it took a longer time than anticipated, because contracts had to be approved from both sides. And we were already developing components earlier on, so we had to use a different plugin tool called Cypress Image Snapshot. So the good thing was it also integrated with our Cypress tests. So in terms of setup, it wasn't difficult. However, we did face some challenges along the way. So that's why I mentioned, Docker in one of the previous slide, because our team had to, make sure that we run the visual baseline images using Docker container. And locally, it was just taking a lot of time. However, we just, proceed with, okay, it's better to have some visual testing in place rather than none at all. So even though we face some limitations, we just still, use that just so that we still have coverage on the visual side. And then if you look at our testing checklist, so I've added it on one of the previous slide. I've created some guidelines that, because prior to doing the Applitools integration, we didn't had any sort of visibility on IE11. So I just had to write a note there that, okay, if you're creating a new component or making changes on the doc site, make sure to test on IE11. And at the same time, I'm also doing a lot of, some exploratory testing on different browsers, just so I can report these issues much earlier on. So it did what's the word, it did slow us down, that's it, at the beginning. And like sometimes we would have to rerun, the visual testing pipeline, because we'll have this like small like pixelated differences. But we just accepted the fact that this is just for a short term. Longer term, we'll switch to Applitools, and all these different issues that we face will be eliminated, and it did. So that's the good thing now.
So we have a lot of Cypress questions. I heard Cypress is difficult to run on Jenkins CI/CD. Is that what you use, or do you use any other tool, or do you have any recommendations?
So I was using Jenkins before, but I haven't tried integrating the Cypress test because now we're using Circle CI pipeline. But I believe if you're using the Cypress Docker images, you should just be able to use it in your Jenkins pipeline. I did had the previous lunch and learn session to show how you can integrate this your Cypress test to a CI pipeline, but it's with using Circle CI, so I can't really answer it much from Jenkins perspective. Cool. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah. So next question, can Applitools integrate with other testing frameworks aside from Cypress?
Yes, so the good thing with Applitools is they basically integrate with almost all of the testing frameworks out there. So you've got integration with Selenium, WebDriver IO, if you're using even mobile testing frameworks like Appium, Espresso, XUI Test, they have some SDKs for those. So if you go to their documentation site, you should be able to see all the different plugins that they have.
Do you use manual tests as well, in addition to the automation, in order to make sure you check the functionalities from the user perspective, or do you completely rely on your automated testing?
Yeah, so we don't rely 100% on the test automation side. We use it mainly to support our testing activities. So so before, when we were finding a lot of issues that our automation tool couldn't find, exploratory testing really helped me in that sense. And in terms of accessibility testing, we still have to do a lot of it manually because only 20% of the automated accessibility violations can be detected. So you can't just rely on the test automation, side. However, what worked is it gave me the confidence just to not be like hands on every single day to support NewsKit Design System, because we also have other teams within product platforms that I have to support. So just by having the test automation like strategy in place, I have more confidence that okay, we won't be releasing any visual bugs to our clients. And at the moment, as I mentioned, we haven't like receive any reports. However, from time to time, we do get like the small odd bug or that we would have got if we were doing some manual testing. So basically, we use both approaches. We don't just rely on one over the other.
Is it possible to run both mobile and web tests using Cypress?
Using Cypress. So Cypress, you can set the different viewports if that's what you're asking. Because Cypress is predominantly a tool for testing web applications. But if you just want to verify that you can set different viewports, you can do that with Cypress as well. You just need to call that I think it's viewport if I'm not mistaken, and then you just have to pass in the viewport size or the actual mobile emulator string. And then depending on, what's your test parallelization approaches, you can either use the Cypress dashboard, or if you're using Applitools, you can just, configure it in your applitools.config.js file, and specify all the different browsers or mobile devices that you want your test to run against.
So we are out of time, so I'll take just one last question. So you mentioned three tools that you POC, two in addition to Applitools. Why did you choose Applitools from the other two tools that you tested?
Yeah. So when we were doing the POC with Screener, so during that time they don't have support yet for Cypress. I do believe now that they have integration for it. But basically before, when we were doing the integration, we didn't want to maintain a separate like Selenium test framework in order to run our Applitools tests. And with Hapo, it gave us, confidence that, we can also support different browsers. However, we found that I think it's still using pixel by pixel difference. So we don't really want to use another tool that uses pixel by pixel because of the different issues that I mentioned at the very beginning. So I found that with Applitools, we can run it on different browsers. We can run it on different mobile emulators. We can also use advanced AI algorithm such as the layout region, for example, the one that I showed, where you can just ignore dynamic data differences. So because of these different like perks, and I forgot to mention that you can also raise, issues directly from Applitools, and it will create a Jira ticket. So if you're using Jira, so because we want to be able to have, a tool that not only supports our testing but also supports, our designers' requirements. That's why we opted for Applitools.
So unfortunately, that's all the time that we have for today. We ran a minute long. I apologize about that. Before I let Marie say her goodbyes, I want to thank everyone that joined us for this live session, and of course, thank Marie for this insightful session. I saw that you have a lot of other questions that we didn't have time to address due to time constraints. So you can obviously connect with Marie on social media and continue the conversation there. I just want to remind you again that the recording and the slides will be emailed to you by end of day Monday, and I hope to see you at our next event. Thank you.
Yep. So just want to say thank you again to everyone, and I hope you found this useful. So as Adi mentioned, you can connect with me on my different social media links at Twitter. I'm most active there now, so you can add me at mcrustrake, and also on LinkedIn, you can add me there. So thank you, and have a good day, and hopefully you have a great weekend. Bye bye.